Welcome to the Passive House podcast, brought to you by Passive House Accelerator, a catalyst for zero carbon building. For news, stories and connections from all flavours of Passive House, check out the articles, videos and more at passivehouseaccelerator.com. Sign up to receive regular updates about events, get your technical questions answered and contribute to the community forum, and of course, attend the weekly online Global Passive House Happy Hour. Now, here's this week's Passive House podcast. Welcome back to another episode of the Passive House podcast. I'm Matthew Cutler-Welsh, coming to you from Auckland in New Zealand.
And I'm Zach Semke in Seattle, Washington.
And I've been enjoying the Olympics. How about yourself, Zach?
I have watched a little of the Olympics. We watched some of the skateboarding. My daughter who's 15. Yeah, she's just starting to skateboard, and so watching these 13-year-old girls just shred it.
I have two boys who are just getting into skateboarding and one daughter who's really into cheerleading. And cheerleading has just been announced as a sport, Olympic sport for the next round. I'm like, wow, you guys, I never thought you were even in the runnings, but hey, who knows? So good stuff. It's great that that's been able to happen, because it was close there for a little while. But awesome to see that. Lots of stuff going on and fantastic interview this week. So let's crack into it. But before we do, we've got some people to thank for the Passive House podcast.
We do indeed. So our founding sponsors are 475 High Performance Building Supply, Backstingui Architects, Glavel Foam Glass Gravel, Minotaur All-in-One HVAC and Dehumidification Units, Mitsubishi Electric Train HVAC US, Partel, RDH Building Science, Rockwool North America, Stowcorp, and Zola Windows. Our champion sponsor is SIGA, and our stakeholder partner is NYSERDA, the New York State Energy and Research Development Authority.
Awesome. Thank you to all those wonderful sponsors and supporters of the podcast, and also to the great community out there who not only listen to this show, but also participate in all the other activities of the Passive House Accelerator. One of those activities recently, Zach, tell us a little bit about the New Gravity events.
Yeah, New Gravity Housing Conference. Yeah, so we collaborated with Green Building United on this year's edition of their very popular and interesting and dynamic conference called New Gravity Housing. And this has been going on now for 5 years, and it's a conference that explores the nexus between high-performance passive house building and affordable housing. And one of the organizers of this conference was Jeremy Avellino. He was on the steering committee of this year's conference. And I've met Jeremy several years ago in Philadelphia, where he's based. He's the principal of a firm called Bright Common, and is a passive house practitioner and just all around smart guy. And he interviewed the keynote speaker at the conference, Dr. Kwesi Daniels, as part at the opening of the conference. So we talk a bit about that and reference the New Gravity conference that went over 2 days during our conversation. A couple of other things we should mention that come up in the interview with Jeremy is that he refers to Saint Ed, and that's Ed Mazria, who is the founder and head of Architecture 2030. He also refers to LITEX and PHFA. So PHFA is the Pennsylvania Housing Finance Agency, and LITEX are low-income housing tax credits. And the kind of the genesis of the New Gravity Conference was to share this really cool policy solution that happened at PHFA that basically awarded extra bonus points for passive house projects who are competing for LITEX, which are a key way of funding affordable housing. So there's been this explosion of affordable housing, passive house in Pennsylvania because of it, and other states have emulated that policy. And also, I refer a couple of times to my friend Bomi Jung, who we had on the Passive House podcast back on episode 39. And she moderated one of the sessions at New Gravity and had lots of smart insights around Passive House and affordable housing and racial justice and climate justice. So I do my best to share some of her ideas in our conversation with Jeremy.
Awesome. That's all good stuff. So once you've finished listening to this episode, then there's plenty of other stuff to go back and check out, including Architecture 2030 and our previous conversations with Bomi and some videos on the Passive House Accelerator website. So let's get into it, shall we?
Sounds good. Welcome, Jeremy Avellino, to the Passive House podcast. I'm super excited to be able to catch up with you and chat for this interview.
Absolutely, Zach. Thanks so much for having me.
Definitely. So, Jeremy, can you start by introducing yourself and your work at Bright Common?
Sure. Yeah, I started a design studio, an architecture studio about 10 years ago called Bright Common, and had the audacity to put the word sustainable architecture after it, which I knew would just get me in trouble. And we eventually came up with a slogan that's high concept, low carbon, all people. Nice. Which, we don't, we like to come up with slogans that we don't always hit, that are kind of out there and aspirational, and just keep pushing us along. And our work, we're in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and the vast majority of our work is so hyper local we can walk to it. So we walk by a lot of our projects every day. So we're very interested in durability, and we're very interested in beauty. And I think that got us very interested in Passive House. I've always been interested tertiarily in sustainability, even if I didn't fully understand what that meant. Just kind of growing up with, particularly with my father, who we joke around about. He would always say, like, turn off the lights. What do I look like? Pico, which is Philadelphia Electric Company, things like that, right? Like he'd always be yelling at me, so like he sort of got me interested in thinking about energy efficiency at a very young age, things like that, right? And I do that to my kids now. And I think as I was studying as an architect, I didn't learn anything about this in the 90s. It was just mostly deconstructivism. So like when I graduated, worked at some firms, had a 10-year stint doing design build stuff. The more I got into making buildings, I was an educator for a while, teaching about buildings, designing buildings. I think all signs pointed towards, how poorly we do housing in this country. Mm-hmm. And that path just, if you're in America, that path is just eventually going to lead, all roads lead to Passive House eventually. If you're paying attention, you care about this kind of work like durability, energy efficiency, health, low toxicity. It just all roads lead there. And so when I started my own company out of the last recession, I wanted to be Passive House certified. And so I took that on. It was a lot of self-training. It was a lot of reading 40-page white papers by, Joe Lesteberg and the crew and some other folks, right? And just like really, really like super painful stuff to take on, all this building science self-education at first, and then eventually sort of, got in front of people who were teaching it to me. And that really just changed the way I thought about architecture. Absolutely, just completely changed it. I went, at some point in my life, I was just kind of like, I just don't know if I could do architecture anymore. It's so problematic. Mm. And that's like a real place of privilege, by the way, to just say that, like I want to change my life or something. But it wasn't that interesting to me anymore, because it just like design alone just isn't that interesting to me. But once I sort of found Passive House, I was like, oh, this is a mission. This is meaningful. This could, as I was becoming aware about climate change, or global warming, as we used to call it, right? It was like, oh, here's a solution to that problem. And that really got me interested in how I could pivot the way I thought about architecture, how I thought about design, and particularly housing, which I have a real passion for. And so I started Bright Common, and that's been going strong for about 10 years, and started with me in my bedroom, and now it's there's 6 of us, and I think soon to be 7, and it's been really fun.
Congratulations!
Thank you.
That's nice work.
And one tiny little shout out, just because my staff is so proud of it, is we just were awarded Architectural Records 2021 Design Vanguard, and
wow. Cool.
Yeah.
So yeah, talk about that.
Well, I kind of didn't really pay much attention to the award scene. It is interesting, and I just like never really thought about applying or anything. And my staff's like, one of the new staff members, Jordan, was like, he's been with us for 2 years. He's like, why aren't you guys applying for awards? And Amanda and I are like, I don't know, I'm just doing the work, And he's like, y'all are doing good work, apply. So I was like, okay. So we went for the Philadelphia Emerging Architecture Prize, which is like a local kind of like, oh, it's a young firm doing cool stuff. And we won that in 2020. And then someone mentioned to me, you should go for the Vanguard. And I'm like, oh, come on, man. That's like an international prize. And then, we won it. They award 10 people this prize a year around the globe. And there was something about, did a really nice piece on us in the July Architectural Record issue. And I'm really honored about it's a huge honor to because they're recognizing that we're doing like urban infill passive house work. And I just kind of like keep my head down and say, no, tons of people are doing this work. But it turns out that, I probably know all the folks doing it in America. They're friends of mine, right? So there's just not that many folks focusing on fussy retrofits and urban infill, work that has an EUI of like, 0.41 or 2 or something like that, right? So, yeah, and I think that the architecture with a capital A is they're starting to pay attention, right? They're starting to listen to like, St. Ed when he's saying, hey, we've got to pay attention to this like 30 years ago, right? And Architectural Record and Architect Magazine are just finally paying attention to this stuff, and I commend them for that. So, yeah.
You just said St. Ed. Are you talking about Ed Masria?
Yeah, St. Ed. Absolutely. Has he not been canonized? I feel like he's been canonized. He ought to be.
No, he totally should be. Well, I mean, I knew who you're talking about. So
yeah, I'm only standing. I mean, whatever I know about Passive House, I'm just simply standing on the shoulders of those who came before me. And
hey, that's
so many local friends, right? Like
that's true for all of us.
Yeah,
definitely.
It's such an open source culture. It's so wonderful. So I'm not reinventing anyone's wheel. It's just.
Well, that's a huge honor. Congratulations. And you're right that it seems like there's some movement happening in the kind of gatekeeper realm of architecture.
That's a good word for it, man.
So the Sterling Prize, I think it's a Sterling Prize in the UK. It's a really highly coveted prize that REBA does, which is the UK version of AIA, awarded a multifamily affordable housing passive house.
I know that project.
Yeah, really
cool.
It's
beautiful. I would describe that project as perfection. I know the one you're talking about. Absolutely. It's everything right about how housing ought to be done.
And I think that there was, from some traditionalists, there's a little bit of like, what? This is not the kind of the high design that we expect. But I mean, you're right. It is perfection. And it's good to see these organizations rewarding, buildings that are going to be part of how we regenerate and get ourselves out of this mess. So
yeah, I think it puts the large firms in check too, because they're awarding smaller firms with this work. Yeah. And we're like a micro firm, right? I mean,
that is so cool. I'm just so happy for you.
Oh, thanks, man.
Yeah.
But I think it puts the big firms in check, right? And literally like even big, like Bjarke Ingels Group, things like that, right? It's sort of like,
right.
There is this political aloofness within the capital A architecture world, and and even in the gatekeeper world, right, where all architecture is political, in my opinion.
Yeah.
And we don't have to agree on our politics. I don't think all of us ever will, obviously, but architecture has been aloof for too long, and its impact on the built environment is radical, and for the most part, not particularly positive, right? So all large architecture firms are kind of, on watch, right? So throwing around terms like carbon neutrality, I think that's the thing we have to like really check, because we're going to see a lot of extreme greenwashing around that, right?
Yeah.
From like, the Bjarke Ingels of the world and the Jeff Bezoses of the world, right? That are just going to say like, no, man, we got this in check and we're going to do it our way, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And what I'm hoping for is that the passive house folks can kind of like, it's such a ground up movement, but it's very difficult to get the passive house mindset into the larger architecture mindset, because they just think it's a small housing mindset. I don't know if you experienced that. But
absolutely. As we get more examples of big projects, big passive house projects, then I think that hopefully will change. But
yeah,
no, I think you're right. So you at the top of our conversation, you talked about these sort of aspirational goals or slogans or that you've adopted to help, I think, partly probably hold yourself accountable, right? Like, okay, yes. I know I'm going to get flack for calling myself a sustainable designer, but that's what I want to do. So I'll accept the flack. Yes. And you also alluded to this kind of mission, right? And this is extending for a lot of us. I think we're starting to ask questions around what we can do to be part of the solution around racial justice and racial injustice, rather, and social injustice. And we were just talking about when the first time you and I met was in Philadelphia after I did a talk, and I invoked MLK in my talk as a way of arguing against doomism. Basically, it was I have a dream, not I have a nightmare speech, right? And you were very kind of gentle about this, but firm, saying, "Oh, well, that was a great talk." And if you're invoking MLK in a talk, I'd love to hear more about racial justice. And you were right on, right? So you've been of kind of my colleagues and peers in this space. You've been thinking about this for a while, and we're two white guys talking about racial, justice. So let's acknowledge that. But we also just had the New Gravity Conference, right? And you, and you were
so
part
good
of this.
too, man. It was so good. So thanks for your
was.
organization in that, and I know you played a part in that.
Hey, likewise. And you were on the steering committee of helping plan that, and were instrumental in inviting the keynote speaker, Dr. Kwesi Daniels, to participate, and you kind of moderated the conversation with him during the keynote, and was really, really amazing. So that's all a preamble to say, where are you at? Tell us about this journey you're on around centering equity in your work, and what are you learning? What are some challenges? Have you had breakthroughs? I think a lot of people would really be curious and appreciate hearing from you about this.
Yeah, absolutely. And I just want to note for the record that your keynote was amazing. Oh. So it made me think of that question, and I'm glad we're still friends, because I was challenging questions of folks, and then they're like, "I don't really want to be friends with you, dude. You're kind of isolating. You're kind of, you ask hard." Yeah. Anyway,
no, you were right on. You were right.
I expect it to come back to me too. Like the reason I put that stuff out there and like have these slogans is I expect people to be like, you're kind of full of shit, man. I saw that multifamily project you did that's not Passive House, and it's what's up with that, bro? Like, that would be a great conversation to have. You know what I mean? I'm always into that. Anyway, so yeah, this has been it's a challenge. It's been a wild ride to own a small business, and then to talk about like radical sustainability. And then I had sort of had in the back of my head, I knew of the term environmental justice. As a Christian, I've read about Black liberation theology and stuff like that, and MLK is one of my heroes. But it was really hard to get this past the surface level of connecting radical sustainability and getting it out of like a white environmental perspective that I kind of came up in, which isn't necessarily bad. It's just sort of limited, right? And then doing, working in a city that's, especially when you're getting into affordable housing, these are predominantly Black and brown neighborhoods. Philly has a 26% deep poverty rate, and a lot of this is structural racial inequity. Renovating homes, including my own, without having much of an awareness about gentrification and my personal role in that. And that's a very complex thing, having neighbors of mine who aren't white being like, it's great that you're renovating your house, is awesome. And then other people telling me that gentrification is super bad, and I'm like agreeing with them. And so it's like, I think that, these are very complex issues that we kind of have to keep relating about face to face. But fast forward to the New Gravity thing, and being asked to, be a part of the steering committee, which is super honor. I just felt really strongly that we needed to have voices that were keynoting that weren't bringing the perspective that like I was already comfortable with as like a white cisgender male, educated on the older side of young, like that kind of thing. Like I already have a lot of white privilege going on, and I'm real into like the general Passive House mission statement, and I don't need that reinforced right now. Post 2020, we need to hear from voices that don't sound like me, and I want those voices in my life too. But like I don't know what your entry point into like anti-racism work is, but the brutal murder of George Floyd by police officer Derek Chauvin was mine. I mean, I had been horrified by police brutality and by other Black people being killed by police in the past, but it would always be it just wouldn't sink in. I think I couldn't let it sink in because of what it meant, and I couldn't face it. It meant that there were two Americas, and that the America that my Black friends and colleagues experienced was very different from my America, right? And so, but after George Floyd was murdered, that kind of broke open, and I had to, so it made me confront, racism inside myself first and foremost, and that's my work. That's no one else's work but mine. I started to look at it inside the profession of architecture, and I started to kind of I was like, well, if I got to look at it inside everything. Is it in the passive house movement too? And of course, we're all humans, so it's it's kind of everywhere in America. So we have to kind of we have to just it's not about feeling super guilty about it and letting it get you shut down. For me, it's just been about wow, as a designer, I kind of want to know what's going. It's almost like an existing building. You really want to get. It's like a deep energy retrofit. You want to get to the heart of what's going on. You don't want to lie about mold or asbestos or anything like that. And that's kind of what racism is. It's like a rot inside of an existing building. You do not want to ignore it when, in your own life. And I think in the communities that we're working within and in our institutions, you want to know that stuff. It's hard information to know. It's hard to face it in yourself. But on the other side is the work, it's freedom, it's joy, it's reconciliation. And to me, it's a lot of design inspiration, because it can be enlivening to really clean things up, which is a lifetime of work. It's not one time, right? And then move on, right? And keep moving on and doing that work with people that aren't a lot of the passive house movement is white folks. That's been my experience. But we've got to figure out how to do this work, and not just diversify the movement. That's very important, but to be continuing to do this work with people who aren't bringing this white environmentalist perspective, right? So, I realized that, as a passive house designer, I do think I hold the keys to solving climate change within the built environment. And I think, but I do think I also need to go deeper and consider the effects of systemic racism on the communities within which I'm working. I need to be more intentional, right? Or else I'm going to fall into the status quo. I know in my heart, I came to this while working with Dr. Daniels, figuring out how to moderate the New Gravity Housing Conference, right? He was very, I can be extra critical, and he was just so supportive of the work that we're doing, where, he made me realize that I know in my heart that the passive house community, that we're doing something right together, right? That we're taking this movement that initially, in my experience, was largely focused on these custom zero energy homes for mostly wealthy folks. Yeah. And we're expanding it to millions of square feet of the healthiest affordable housing in the country. We're helping out the most vulnerable people in society. But if we don't see that the source of carbon emissions has as much to do with systemic racism that it does with material choices or energy use, I think that we risk missing the mark, and also just missing this huge opportunity to expand the movement beyond this sort of building science-based thing where we're just focusing on the newest technology. All that stuff is super rad. We should not stop sharing this information about the way that we do at conferences. But I think that we're going to miss a huge opportunity if we don't involve all kinds of voices that don't look like me. Does that make sense? I mean, the Kwesi was talking about being intersectional, and actually we have the opportunity for Passive House to extend the civil rights movement. Those are his words. I was wow, I would like to be a part of that work. I feel like I don't have the tools to do that. And he's like, well, you got a lot of tools. You just have to, it's about accessibility. You have wisdom. Who has access to that wisdom? Mm-hmm. Do only white folks have access to this wisdom who have a PhD? And I'm it kind of feels that way sometimes, right? So how do we as a passive house community break down the barriers and intentionally not just work on making affordable housing, but making this wisdom outsourced and shared to all kinds of people? Does that make sense?
It does. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it really resonates with me. Thank you. one of the things that I've heard many times now, as I've been kind of grappling with what does racial justice and work look like for me and at the Accelerate. And I share the murder of George Floyd was a huge turning point. I mean, for so many of us, I think when we talk about justice, racial justice, climate justice, we're talking about power.
Yes.
And we're part of a community of people that shapes the built environment in different ways, right?
Yes.
And so one of the key questions then that arises is how do we engage with community so that there's local community power over decision making around how that built environment is getting shaped. So are you seeing that? How is that manifesting for you in your work? Because I know it's not easy. And so I think a lot of practitioners are then asking, well, how do I do this? Like, it's not.
Yeah. They all want to know, like, you bring up these hard things and you're like, cool, what do I do? And I'm like, all right, I don't know. Pause for a second. And I just try to tell people, like, a lot of the work is like, just like letting it sink in first. It's not, the Passive House folks always want to like, cool, what's the solution? I'm just ready to do it. I just love that about us, right?
Can I pop it into an energy model? Come on.
Yeah, that's right. I just like, I want data, I want man, and like, that's all really good stuff. But some of it is just like sitting with the discomfort of like the reality of like how we even got here. And that's what's harder work to do. And then like, that will affect how, personally, I think that affects even the details that we draw and how we draw them. Like when we think about like sequencing details and we think about like, this can't just be always about expert culture. This has to be about replicability for like, if we're going to be building retrofits with like, for instance, one of our projects had some returning citizens on it. And it's just like, folks who are just learning some new skills. How can we design a building that's like really accessible in that way, but still uses low toxicity materials? That is like really an interesting design problem. So I think that this kind of thinking can just is about design for me. That's why it's exciting. So anyway, how it's working out in our work, it's in some interesting ways and in some really unfortunate ways, right? Like that I don't want to repeat, but like we're getting into like, thanks to the work of Tim McDonald and the sort of PHFA movement and Tim's a personal friend of mine and lots of others who are really pushing to have QAPs around the country, include points for Passive House, things like that. I love this movement. It's like the most boring revolution ever, like this sort of like digging in this like point structure into something nobody knows about. It's really beautiful. It's subversive, but the low-income housing tax credit industry, like that has allowed me an entry point as an architect to do, we're doing a couple 30-unit scattered sites right now in Philly, and to, I think, the zero energy ready homes level, and which is like Passive House light, but it's a lot of the same stuff. And going through that process, what you realize is I'm glad that the system exists. I don't want to disparage it too much, but it's fairly paternalistic in the sense that like you're really kind of doing this work at people, not necessarily like there's no community engagement kind of whatsoever in that sense, like that I had hoped, and it's just not set up for that, right? It's set up to like do this like really rigorous system, and maybe that's just okay, right? Like I would like to see the LIHTC thing expanded to make millions and millions of more units, right? Like I don't want to disparage it in that sense, but it's like you really don't get the sense of like, I don't know if the community is excited about this or not, because it's just not, we're not engaged at that level. And it's not because our client doesn't care. You're wonderful people. So, and I think that's the case with a lot of LIHTC projects, frankly, it does get criticized for that.
And probably a lot of just non-LIHTC
non-LIHTC
housing projects. Just the pace and the cycle of project development. It's pretty breakneck.
Yeah, it's breakneck, exactly. So like the argument of like not having enough time, which I had a good friend remind me that busyness is a product of white supremacy. If you really this really challenged me. Like the fact that we're all in this like hyper late capitalist system where we're kept at this breakneck pace all the time, and we might say things in the back of our head like, I don't have time to engage the community right now. Okay,
right.
I don't have time for this. Yeah. I'm trying to solve for climate change. That kind of thinking, and I am totally guilty of it, is by design one of the things about like these systems of white supremacy that keep even white people too busy to like reconcile and like
make change,
what we want to do. And I'm really, really challenged by that, and I have to sit with that discomfort, right? And just like recognize that that's a truth in my life, and I got to work on that, But some of the positive stuff too is like just recognizing some of this stuff and sitting with it. It's like, all right, next time, how can we do that better? And we're working on a series of, we do a lot of scattered site work because Philly has a lot of empty lots and retrofits and stuff like that of row houses. So we're doing this project where we're designing these duplexes that are designed in lower North Philadelphia in this Latino neighborhood, where we're designing them to stretch to the left and right a little bit for like different lot sizes. And these are tiny lots, man, like 12 feet wide lots, like, and you know, fitting duplexes again that are not shooting all the way to the passive house level, but really taking all the components in there and working with it. And this is one where we're working with a long time social services group that has been in the neighborhood for 40 years and really represents the neighborhood well. And we are working with the community and going through listening exercises and stuff like that. And I can just tell you that it's just so much more rewarding to go through that process. And there really, of course, is time for it when it's planned in by the developer, right? And another one in West Philadelphia where we're working on a deep energy retrofit of an old brick mixed use building. It had a commercial storefront on the ground floor and an apartment above, and that's being turned into the headquarters for Community Development Corporation for, you know, their headquarters. It's sort of like, it was a hub for like food redistribution during COVID, and like, you know, it was like and it's an apartment above, it's things like that. And the idea is that we want to retrofit this to the Enterprise Green Community Standard, and probably plus. There's a lot of things we're doing in there that are much far above that. And they want to use this as a model to teach people in the neighborhood the value of this work so that we can get some agency around DIYs in what is predominantly a Black neighborhood, right, that is experiencing gentrification, and figure out how can we get funding to help folks do this work on their own houses and to hire local contractors. So the developers were very conscious about putting the bid out to, you know, 3 locally owned Black-owned contracting businesses, right? And so that is all the developers and these nonprofits leading that way. And so we're really happy to be a part of that. And I think that that's really what it comes down to. Having the architect, you know, get in there and say, I wish it was this way. I want to listen. I want to engage the community more. That's all good, but we're just often brought in so late into the game. We do push for it, but a lot of the times developers will just say, not interested, don't have time. We got to keep this going, you know? So there's pros, you know, there's positive stories and there's like difficult ones too.
Right. Well, but when there's a forum or an opportunity for real engagement and participation in design, in decision-making by local people, then you have at least the potential for democracy and design kind of.
Oh, absolutely. I'm a firm believer in like a charrette process. You know, my own design processes, I kind of come into everything really, really open. We don't hold on to any particular style, or the only approach we want to do is like sound building science. That's, you know, like low carbon, and we're always learning about what that means. But like, we want to present we don't want to hold back what we know. So we'll present some broad basics to a community group and say, this is kind of what we think. This is what we know. This is what we know about passive house, why I think it's a good idea. And then to have folks tell us about resiliency, right? Like, one thing I've learned, Zach, is that, you know, my definition of sustainability is a good one, but it's from a certain perspective, this kind of Eurocentric perspective, and it's good. There's a strong environmentalist movement in the U.S. that's been fairly decent. But like, if you know, as Dr. Daniels reminded me, if you're interested in learning about resiliency, then, you know, listen to stories, listen to Black communities in America about resiliency, about, you know, beyond just survival, but thriving amidst impossible circumstances for the past 400 years. And I have everything to learn about that. So when we work within these communities, we need to understand that communities already know what they need and what is best for them. And they don't need people telling them what that is. But they also, you know, we worked on a community design collaborative project. We were helping this 108-year-old church in West Philly reimagine their campus. And that was very, you know, they kind of knew what they wanted, but they were also very interested in what we had to bring to the table. But it was sort of like how we related and how it fit in specifically to their culture, if that makes sense.
Yeah,
as opposed to kind of jamming it in there. So like, my experience has been like folks who are systemically disenfranchised and under-resourced tend to really receive this message about Passive House. Like it just makes sense to them. Like, oh my gosh, that makes so much sense, right? I've had much more trouble selling Passive House to folks who are basically the richer they are, the harder the message is. And, I don't want to say that they're not invited to the table, but I think if we're going to clean up the planet, you've got to understand that this is going to end up being about wealth redistribution and putting some resources down and putting your money where your mouth is. And it can't just always be about a luxury driven movement, if that makes sense, or we're going to have to redefine that. We're going to have to figure out how we're going to share together to figure out, these conflating and conflicting problems.
You mentioned like cleaning up, right? And so I want to share that anecdote. We were talking a little bit before the interview about this, of the science of hygiene, right? And
yeah,
I'll preface it by saying there are so many critically important ways that we need to engage with and learn from and empower and respond to communities and what they want from their buildings, right? And make sure that we're designing buildings and spaces that are supportive of practicing culture and community, and not ones that hinder that, right? So that's the kind of the context here. But I'm going to be paraphrasing Bomi Jung. Bomi moderated the session yesterday with Satpal Kaur and Ifeoma Ebo that was entitled Beauty of Justice, the Politics of Space and Aesthetics. And she was riffing a little bit on Dr. Daniels and his evoking of the
beloved community.
Of the beloved community. Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
She was talking about and
I should say Dr. Martin Luther King's idea of the beloved community. Right?
Thank you.
Yeah,
exactly. How do we make that manifest in our work? So she was talking about the importance of community engagement and involvement and participation, and she was saying, take a look at this. The science of hygiene. And when doctors realized that if they washed their hands, that was really good for health, that fewer people died in hospitals and got sick in hospitals. And so once that science provided that insight, doctors weren't going to patients and saying, I just want to check in with you if it's okay if I wash my hands, right? It was like, there's like, this is the right thing to do. We know this because the science says so, and we know the implications. And we are at a place where we know the same thing about Passive House, that we know that when we do Passive House, it creates resilient spaces. They're more healthy. They're better places to live. And so we can feel confident about that we can provide these better buildings to communities, and be responsive to those communities in ways where we can, shape them, these buildings, so that they serve local people. I think it's important to recognize the fact that Passive House is better for people.
It is, and it's I think it's demonstrably better for people. And I'm really proud of the work. I'm proud to be a part of the work that of the movement, and I think it keeps me being an architect. If it wasn't for Passive House, I think I was kind of just done with architecture. I told you that, which is such a place of privilege, by the way. But it was just this frustration with the culture of architecture, and how little architects really cared about their effect on the environment. And it was really it's a very self-centered, egotistical movement. But there's a lot of good architects out there trying to just do the work. And I think that by and large, it's turning, as you said, the gatekeepers are kind of beginning to take notice of the need to decarbonize the built environment, right? And I think that that's righteous. My fear is, it's still just a big building focus, and I think that is really important. But it's just sort of like, here's 5 ways to green concrete. It's like, or can we just stop using concrete? Which is almost impossible. But it's just like we're still focused on this advertisement and big industry based way to how do we green steel? It's like, I don't know, design so you don't need it, right? Which is you can't do that if you have tall buildings. But architectural record to have like one amazing issue with like Saint Ed on it, and then just talking about like the 2030 challenge, and he wins the AIA Gold Medal Prize, and then the next one is about tall buildings that are all glass.
Definitely. Well, you mentioned the kind of the ego driven architecture, and so I'm going to paraphrase Bomi Jung again. And if Bomi's listening, she's probably rolling her eyes because I'm sure I'm doing a crappy job at it. But I was just really struck by another thing that came up in the session yesterday related to the beloved community, and how can we make that manifest as designers, and we should be making buildings like we would make buildings for the people who are our loved ones, the ones that we love, right? And we were talking earlier, like I've been thinking about my house in Seattle as we just went through this crazy heat dome thing that killed a lot of people. And we've also had, this horrible smoke that's been coming, wildfire smoke that's super toxic that's been coming.
Well, it just reached me in Philadelphia, by the way.
Right. Yeah. Right. It's right. It knows no borders. And so when I've been thinking about our old house and how to make it better, and, the key thing is that I want a place where when it's really crazy hot in the future and say the grid goes down, that my family can survive and be be okay, or that when the smoke comes every summer, that we're not jeopardizing the health of our children just to live. And so it's the moves about making a better building that for my loved ones. That is I think that's that can be a guide. It's not the same. It's an important guide in thinking about what is the righteous thing to do in the world when we're doing buildings.
Well, and I think that led a lot of the passive house folks to do passive house, was answering the question, what's the right thing to do here as an architect? And I'll just speak for the architects because that's like my tribe. What's the right? I want to be a good person. I want to do the right thing. It's a problematic industry. What's the best thing? And all roads lead to passive house. So if you're dealing with housing and then like commercial and stuff like that, hopefully we're going to expand this movement into much larger buildings. And that eventually, though, we've got to keep asking that question. And folks like Bomi Chung and Dr. Daniels are going to help us to see that we can't just stop at building science, right? That we have a real opportunity to go further than that if we want to do the right thing, right? Also a great movie, Do the Right Thing. One of the best movies I've ever seen. So good. I'm here listening to Public Enemy in my head right now.
Yeah, nice.
So good. Dating myself. I had this wonderful opportunity early in the week to be on a panel in Philadelphia with the Democratic Socialists of America and their Philly branch, and they sort of wanted to listen from an architect who did some work, because they're all into Green New Deal stuff, and so am I, And so this was a panel about Green New Deal housing. And I met one of the smartest people I've ever heard in my life, this man named Daniel Aldana Cohen. He's a PhD. He's an assistant professor of sociology at the University of Pennsylvania. And he's the director of something called the Socio-Spatial Climate Collaborative, which is just radical. And he's a real expert on Green New Deal housing policy. And it was incredibly challenging information for me, right? And really inspiring. I get inspired by things that I'm not doing yet, but need to figure out. And he just kept talking about Green New Deal. A Green New Deal for housing is an anti-racist policy, right? He's reminding us that the median income of white people is still 10 times more than the median income of Black families. And that is directly attributed to generational wealth from housing. So he talked about the Sunrise Movement, right? Who he calls the climate kids, because it's a very young movement, right? And he says this was mostly a white upper class movement of kids, and they were looking for what's the good thing to do, and this is his stuff. He said it kept coming back to housing, right? They all realized that this was in New York City in particular, but they decided to throw down with the Green New Deal housing folks, because that specifically was a movement for Black lives in New York City. Now think about that, right? This idea that the greenest thing you can do is about housing, and that's not even the passive house movement, right? But I will tell you, the Democratic Socialists, or at least Mr. Aldana Cohen, he could spout off passive house rhetoric better than 99.9% of architects I have ever met in my entire life. Like the
That's
Democratic
fantastic.
Socialists know all about passive house. They know all about deep energy retrofits. They know all
Right
about
on.
all electric. They know all about heat pump everything. They know all about induction stoves. Like they just knew it all, right? And it all made sense with where they're coming, right? You know, he kept talking about having to anchor ourselves in a struggle for environmental and racial justice, that was where we needed to be anchored, and coming out of that place is how you do housing. You know, for him, and I think for me too, it has to be this like movement of the people that we have to, like architects aren't going to solve it. Passive house folks aren't going to just solve it. It's like policy is very important, and major policy changes like at the federal level are going to need to happen. We keep talking about like, how do we finance this? How do we finance that? And like their solution was like, well, you change federal policy so that we have billions and billions of dollars, which are tied to this concrete awareness of lawmakers who understand the immediacy of the climate crisis and understand that 40% of that roughly is buildings. And then we just simply don't have a choice but to literally pay people to deep energy retrofit their houses, right? And that becomes creating millions and millions of non-market housing, breaking out of the binary of market housing or affordable housing into something called non-market housing, which I can't wrap my head around yet, Zach. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But this idea that housing shouldn't just be tied to wealth acquisition or like generational wealth acquisition. It needs to be a basic human right. And that is the right of every person. And therefore, in a democratic society, the responsibility of those who govern to provide that, right? And he also talked about, we just got to hire the best architects to do this stuff and the best builders. I was just like, yes, man, let's do this. So like, we think we're all just trying to get that one house done and that one retrofit. And that's beautiful stuff. We need to learn this technical stuff. But I think the real challenge and the real problem ahead is both is like a policy shift to think about a World War II level mobilization of like deep energy retrofitting all the houses, which is like, I can't even begin to fathom that,
hundreds of millions of, like
how?
Millions of jobs, tens of millions
exactly.
of jobs.
And that's what he said. He's like, do you want to create, like, this is about green jobs, man.
Yeah.
And this is about a redistribution of wealth and redefining, you know, and he had all kinds of ideas for it, like taxing more than just income, like taxing inheritance and taxing, you know, like all kinds of stuff, right? Like we've really got to stop thinking that billionaires are going to solve sustainability and the future for us. They're not, you know, and it's a much more complicated movement to depend on people, especially after this last 4 years. But I'm going to throw my hat into that ring.
Well, Jeremy, this has been really amazing. I knew it would be, and this has been super fun. Is there anything you want to add before we close up here?
I mean, can I end with like a cool quote? I like that.
Yes, please do. Please do. I would love to hear.
John Perkins is one of my spiritual heroes, and he's a Black American, and he was a pioneer of Christian community development. And you know, he was all about working out racial reconciliation, for decades long struggle, right? And he talks about it as a movement of the people too. And he says, go to the people, live among them, learn from them, love them. Start with what they know, build on what they have. But of the best leaders, when their task is accomplished, when their work is done, the people will remark, we have done it ourselves. And to me, I really love what John Perkins has to say about that, because I think as architects and developers and passive house practitioners and down to the level of energy model of everybody, like energy raters, right? Or I should say up to the level, these are our heroes, right? But we want communities to say, we have done this work, right? And I think that our job is to be midwives and assistants and listeners and to share what we know, but we want the communities that we're within to say, we've done it. And I personally, I am barely there, but that's where I want to go. That's where I want to be.
That was Jeremy Avellino. It was a pleasure to get to talk with him and do this interview. What were your impressions?
So many. Straight from the top, the audacity of having a mission statement with the word sustainability in it. I really like that idea of putting yourself out there and also being accountable, not just yourself and being willing, but us as friends, as colleagues, people on a similar journey to call each other out and say, hey, that thing you did, is that in line with what you say you do when it comes to sustainability or putting our brand out there? I think it's a really good point. I definitely want to encourage people to come up with a mission and brand themselves with that, but also for us to hold each other at account to that. I really like that idea. Obviously, the social side, racism, equity, big themes. And I have been guilty of thinking that it's an American issue for quite some time, because I hear a lot about Black Lives Matter, this, all the examples brought up in this interview. It's very easy for someone like me, privileged white male in the Southern Hemisphere, to say, oh, that's America. Mm-hmm. Yesterday, I was on a Teams meeting which was talking about healthy housing, and I've realized that was a room full of privileged white middle-aged people, and there weren't, in our case, Māori at the table there. In Australia, it's very rare to find an Aboriginal architect. They are out there, but there's very, very few of them. So I really like the concept that Jeremy was talking about. I mean, so many concepts, but one of the things that really stood out for me was that racism is like a rot inside a building.
Yeah.
It's very easy to clean away the odd incident or the thing that pops up, and you can sort of wipe it away. But what we really need to do is look at the underlying cause. And we probably need to sit and think about it for a little while and be with it and realize what's going on there and be honest about it. Rather than, as we tend to do, because a lot of us are engineers, architects, we love solutions and problem solving. We jump straight into problem solving mode. And that is like a bunch of white people sitting around a Teams meeting trying to come up with great ways of strategizing how to fix the housing problem is a classic example of that. We need to probably organize what we would call a hui, like a true, open, honest meeting with people that we can learn from about different ways of doing things. And I think we can bring some really great stuff to the table. Building science, passive house, there's some really good ideas, but there's a big chunk missing that we're sometimes a little bit deaf to and not open to really sitting down and finding out what the solutions are for the housing. Anyway, I could probably rant on that. I have been thinking about it, but Jeremy definitely struck a chord with a few of those underlying issues of just sitting with the issue and being open to other people's ideas of the problems that we're actually trying to solve.
Yeah. Yeah. And seeking out those opportunities to create a place for like real old-fashioned participatory democracy in our work, at the small community level scale.
Yeah.
So important.
And not using our white privileged excuse of busyness as a reason to not engage at that level, which, it's kind of, that touched a nerve there.
Yeah, it sure did. Sure did. There's plenty of opportunities for sitting with discomfort.
Yeah. But on the other side, another thing that I've witnessed, more so for builders, is that sense of pride and rediscovering their art. And I've had a couple of experiences of fairly, builders have been building for quite a while. We're probably almost ready to start pulling away or doing something different. And then they came across a client who either asked them to do Passive House or some sort of really high performance home, and they just lit up again. And suddenly they remembered why they wanted to be a builder in the first place. And Jeremy, it sounds like, had a similar experience from architecture. He was thinking about, it had enough. It was just boring. And then discovering Passive House really gave him purpose in what he was doing. And it became a mission. And I've seen that enough times to believe in the idea of having a mission, but also having something that you can be truly proud of, and that sort of re-engaging with your art and your craft, I think is a really is a cool thing from a personal point of view. Obviously, there's downstream benefits for everyone else involved in that project, but just as a professional, I think that's one of the great things about finding good work to do.
And good on Jeremy and on Bright Common for that, for the award-winning the award-winning work that they've been doing, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I think that I mean, that's not why, obviously that's not why he that's just an outgrowth of the kind of passion and re-engagement with purpose, I think, that he's experienced. So
yep,
it was.
No, he wasn't even interested in
yeah,
awards,
right. No, it was an afterthought. It was an afterthought, which is so
for one of his graduates. But that is a good point as well. To don't be afraid to put yourself out there, because awards, they're obviously a great recognition for yourself, but they also inspire others. So don't feel bad about putting yourself up for an award, because if it means that we get Passive House on the front of a magazine or get people talking about different ideas, then everyone wins.
That's right.
Yeah, awesome. So much really good stuff. He said it a couple of times, but a lot of roads lead to Passive House, which he's obviously found as one of the solutions. And I guess that's why it's hard not to just jump to the solution straight away. But it is important, I think, that we take people along on that journey. And also, Passive House is a technical solution to a lot of technical and social issues, but Passive House isn't urban planning, and it's not inclusive design, and it's not necessarily thinking about green space or intergenerational living and how we do better ways of funding. So there's all these other issues around financing and urban planning, sustainable, holistic design, that we should still engage with other people when we're thinking about what might become a Passive House project. So, yeah, I really like Michael Ingwe's comments that I've heard him talk about beyond Passive House. And I think that's a really good example of that, of Passive House being a really good core, but there can be a lot around that can provide even better outcomes for a whole community. We could go on, but that was quite an epic one, and I really, like I've said before, great that we have ability to talk to such great guests. So thank you, Zach, for finding Jeremy and the Gravity conference, but also that interview and taking the time out was great. All right. What else have we got coming up? It's busy time coming into your fall, be our springs shortly.
Yes, that's right. So, well, first in August, the accelerator is going to be taking a little bit of a break on programming. So Construction Tech and Happy Hour will be on break in August, and the podcast will be as well. So this is a chance for us at the podcast and also us at the Construction Tech and Happy Hour to put together some really great programming for the fall. So we're looking forward to doing that. The fall is going to be nuts in the Passive House world. Because there's so many big events happening. So the International Passive House Conference will happen in September. Passive House Canada is holding a major tower retrofit event. FIAS is having the FIAS Con conference in October. I know that the South Pacific Passive House Conference is also happening in the fall. There's a Net Zero, Getting to Zero conference that's happening in New York, and NESI that is having a big New York conference as well. So tons of stuff. We will share information about all that in the show notes.
Awesome. So much going on. Thank you for all of that. And yeah, you will have seen all those additional episodes still popping up in the feed. So if you haven't, check all those out, and also the other great content all over the Passive House Accelerator website. That's it for this week. I hope you enjoyed that. Thank you, Zach.
Yeah, thank you, Matthew. And, you know, I guess this signals the close of season 1 of the Passive House podcast. And I just want to say a huge thank you for making this happen. I mean, it's just been such a pleasure, and it's been, what a privilege to interview all these great people. And it's been really gratifying to see how many people are listening to the podcast, and it's so fun. So thank you.
It is. Yes, thank you. It has been a lot of fun. And like I say, thanks to all the great audience out there, and for sharing this. Hope it's been, obviously interesting and useful enough to keep listening. And we've also had some great support behind the scenes. We've had the 2 Sydneys helping out.
Indeed.
And a whole bunch of other people, too many to mention at this stage, but there is a big team of people putting things together at the accelerator. So couldn't do this without all of those great people.
Definitely. Yeah.
All right. We will be back. So thank you. Stay tuned. And I don't know, go make some, go sit with whatever you need to sit with, and then design good houses.